said, my name is Ian. I've been an open source user, contributor, and maintainer for more than 10 years now. And this is my talk that's a practical guide for working with open source software. So first I'm going to talk about what your goals should be when you are working with open source software, either as an individual or as an organization. I'm going to cover a little bit about the open source software communities and a profile of some of the sorts of developers that you can expect to run into. I'm going to talk about some good ways to contribute to open source software, and I'm going to give some advice about how you might be able to change your organization to become a little bit more open source friendly. So first of all, the ways to get the most from open source software, of course, involve taking advantage of the fact that you've got the freedom to build whatever you want on this source code that you have. But I'm going to talk also about ways that you can use this to minimize your lifetime costs of your changes to that source code, as well as using the open source community to help produce better, smaller, and more maintainable code for the changes that you're working on. The concept of source code being a liability is a familiar one to any developer. As your source code grows, it becomes harder to make changes, it becomes harder to reason about it, it's harder to bring new people in. The way that open source approaches or attacks this problem is, of course, by distributing that workload, distributing that maintenance burden across as many people as possible, and by encouraging people from outside to contribute. This only works, though, when the people that are working on the project are staying current, staying with the latest versions of the projects that they care about. So it's very important as a developer to do this, because this also helps you know immediately when something that you're working on has broken because of a change that was upstream, and you can communicate that right when it happens to the developers, when it's fresh in their mind what might have been changing. By running the latest code, you can also help make sure that you can have a voice, you can shape the features as they're being developed. So your goals really when working with open source software should be having as little code as possible that you yourself maintain, taking advantage of those features as they come out from the upstream project, and keeping your costs controlled over the long run by, again, keeping the amount of code that you maintain separately to a minimum. I'm going to borrow some ideas from Alina Williams' recent talk in Montreal about why people contribute to open source software. One of the reasons is that it really gives freedom to program the way that you want to. If you have an idea of exactly the perfect way to solve a problem, you can just go and do it. You don't need to get anybody's permission. You can also really try to become an expert in the domain by working as much as you want on that. And finally, of course, not finally, but one of the most common reasons is you just have a problem to solve. You want to scratch an itch. And this is a great way to share the code that you've produced to solve that problem. A lot of people also contribute because they want to learn how to do something. So it's a great way to learn how an operating system works is to build an operating system. If you want to learn how a compiler works, you can write a compiler. And the vast majority of open source projects are like this. They're a single committer, a single contributor, and probably only a single user, but people put it out there so that they can, anybody else can learn from it if they want to. It's also great for exposure. The individuals that write that software are essentially building, this is sort of what's called a GitHub resume. They are promoting themselves through showing what they can produce. It's also a good way to promote a project. If you're trying to solve a problem, pointing people to this solution is a good way to get people working on it. And it's also great, for me, when I'm reviewing resumes, it's a whole lot nicer, than just going over the resume, to go to somebody's open source history and see, real examples of how they interact in the community, real examples of the code that they produce. There are also people that contribute to open source for moral reasons. We are on this world for so long, and we should probably be increasing knowledge, and this is one great way to do it. People like myself are lucky enough to be often paid to work on open source. I'm working on a couple interesting open source projects right now, and many other people in organizations are doing the same, and that's actually increasing a lot. But probably the biggest reason people work on open source is programming is fun. You know, it's this endless series of challenges that you can set up for yourself. You can make it as hard or as easy as you want, and you know, getting to that final solution is interesting. It's challenging. And not only is it challenging to solve the little problem that you're on, or interesting to solve the little problem that you're on, it's also very satisfying to be part of a community when you're working on a larger project. When you're working in an open source community, you're going to be running into a lot of people that you could describe as being self-motivated, smart, creative. And this is a great way to sort of satisfy that human need, the need that we all have for recognition, for that sense of connection with people. Especially if you do a lot of consulting work from your own home and are otherwise, you know, missing that human contact. But you will find that these communities can be somewhat chaotic, or you know, without any kind of real big structure, and they can have some members, or the community as a whole can have members that are quite opinionated about certain things. This type of personality is often, more often than most types of developers, they will, you know, their interests will be moving. So it's natural to expect people will come and go at a high rate in many of these communities. So there's an open source project that you care about, that you're using. You should find out, you should ask yourself, or you should find out how large is the community around this project? Is it a new project? Is it well established? Is it dead? You know, has there been no commits on this project in the past 2 years, but you still want to actually pick up that source code and run with it? You want to find out how the community is structured. You know, are there people that are responsible for certain parts? Who has what roles? These are all necessary steps in working with these open source communities. But probably the hardest part of collaborating in an open source community is accepting some very public criticism. And there's no easy way about this. This is a learned skill, and everything is very public. Anytime, you know, you say something, if somebody calls you out on it, somebody, you know, thinks that it wasn't a good idea, that's, you know, stuck in Google, you know, for all eternity, or for however long Google wants it, whichever is shorter. And so you need to just, you know, learn how to accept the fact that people make mistakes. One way to deal with this is to try to be as humble as possible. Be, you know, more humble than you would be, because I know, you know, we're all very bright. We know the perfect solution to these things, but it's still better to say, oh well, I've looked at this and this, and I think, you know, and this is also to help protect other people who are having trouble accepting criticism. You know, jumping on somebody for something that you disagree with is a bad idea. And it's also about just keeping your ego in check. So one way of dealing with this very public communication from an organization, if an organization is sponsoring this development, is to use a personal email when you're working. So this way you can make sure that something that you have said won't end up getting tweeted and embarrass, you know, the organization that you're working for, because it's just associated with your name. And also, when you move from this community to another community, you get to take those contributions with you. It's easy to see the work that you've done out in the public. So my favorite way of interacting with open source communities is over IRC. And IRC is a really great tool because it lets you speak directly with the project developers and the other end users of these projects. And just by being on the channel, on the IRC channel, and listening to what other people are having trouble with, this is very useful information. You find out things about a project that you don't see in the README or in the documentation. You find out what people are trying and having trouble with, because they're usually the same things again and again. While you're there, it helps so that you can pick up some of the culture of the project. And the way that people use IRC is different than most other sort of chat and forums. It's used in an interruption-free way. So if you send a message to somebody, it doesn't immediately blink and pop up on their screen. It's just there in the background. And when that person decides to look at it, they'll look at it. And this is totally normal. You know, it could be many minutes or hours between when you send a message and when you get a response. And that mode of communication is what makes IRC so great for international development. because many of these open source projects are very international. There are people in lots of different time zones, and so it will be very normal for the right person to show up many hours later and answer your question. Now, just by hanging around, you'll find that you'll see many of those same questions again and again. And a really easy way to participate is just by giving the same answers that somebody has, that you've seen people give before that have led to a good solution. So now you're, visible. You're a visible part of the community, even if in a small way. So there's really only two rules that I have for IRC. The first one is when you show up on an IRC channel, ask your actual question. So, don't show up and say, "Hi, can anybody help me?" and then wait for a response. Some of these channels, some of these open source projects have literally more than 1,000 people sitting there in the channel just idling in the background who will occasionally check the history to see what people have been talking about. Every message where it's just, "Hi, can somebody help me?" is a waste of all of these people's time. They're giving their time because they know a little bit about the project, and it's really, even though it feels strange, it feels like you should be polite and start a conversation in a normal way. It's not like that. You just get straight to the point. Ask your question. And then, rule 2, don't leave. I mean, ideally, you never leave. You just leave the IRC thing open, stay there all the time, but expect that the question might be answered hours later. And by not leaving, that helps you be part of the community. So if you've been in IRC for a little while, and maybe you've been talking to somebody about a problem that you've had, and they say, "Oh, that seems like a real bug. You should report that." Well, an easy way to file a bug is to take the log of your communication on IRC and just drop that in the report. It gives some background. It lets the developers know who you've been talking to and what they suggested. But of course, it's always better if you can provide actual code that fails and explain everything that you have tried to try to reduce the amount of back and forth. Try to reduce the number of comments that need to go back and forth between you and the developers to figure out exactly what the problem is. And finally, and this is something that not enough people do, is just spend a little time to make sure it looks nice. This is going to a human, and this human is maybe volunteering their time. They may be getting paid by a different organization, but they deal with a lot of bugs that are not their, not in their domain necessarily, and you are asking for their time. Just spend a little bit of effort. Make sure it looks nice. If you need to provide a table or a chart to describe a complicated issue, do that. The better presented bug reports, you're much more likely to get a more positive response. The next step from there is typically writing a patch, writing a change to the code that's there. And this might be because you found a bug and you've already fixed it. But it's always best with these communities to start small. Heck, you can even start tiny. You can submit a patch that just fixes spelling and grammar in the documentation. I mean, that's a great way to start. It's very likely to get accepted, and immediately you're on a roll, establishing yourself as part of the project. But you would typically start with a small bug fix, and it is good to have discussed your approach, discuss how you're going to fix the problem with people. IRC is great for that, or the mailing list. But then you need to make sure that you are using the developers' tools. If the developers use Git, make sure you use Git. They have contribution guidelines, and make sure you follow them. Put the right messages in the commit log. Make the right stylistic changes to the source code. Just avoid the back and forth that would be a big waste of time, of these developers' time, just to follow the documentation that's already there. And if your change actually affects something that end users will see, include a description or include that change in the documentation. That saves time for the developers, having to first, read and understand your code and then realize, oh, yes, we'll need to tell the users about this. Plus, it also serves to document what your change actually does when it's all together in that same patch or that same pull request. If you really want a gold star on your pull request, also include unit tests. Include some tests that can be included in the standard sort of test suite that shows the thing that you fixed and shows that it works. Some projects even require this, but throwing it in there, I mean, that never hurts. That's always enough to put a smile on a developer's face. Now, after you've done all of this, and this is a lot of work, you also have to be completely prepared that you're going to have to throw it all out and write it again. There could be discussion on the issue. Developers might decide that there's a different way of approaching this problem, that maybe there's a change to other parts of code that are going to make this patch unnecessary. So because of this fact, it's really, really important that you get these patches in as soon as possible. If you're relying on a change that you've made to an upstream project and you build more code on, that you keep to yourself that relies on that, and you find out months later that that original change isn't going to go in, that's going to be a very big cost for you. So larger than a simple patch would be adding a whole new feature. And this you'd have to take even slower. So this, I would say, start from documentation. Start from a README in a repository, and again, make it look nice, make it look good, make sure that people would be interested in it, they understand what it is that you're doing, and announce it on the mailing list. Announce it to the developers. Try to get buy-in. Try to get somebody to tell you, yes, that seems like a good idea, yes, that makes sense, or better yet, oh, I think somebody else already did that, it's over there, or maybe you should work with this person because there's this other thing that's very similar. And this is something that you want to do before you start the large, long process of coding, testing, documenting, polishing, and so on. And if it is a large feature, this is something that you will want to work with the project developers throughout, just to make sure that you don't get off track. Because this work, of course, is expensive to have to redo, and that's what they're there for. I mean, they want your contribution. It's very cheap for the project developers to give you a little bit of advice to keep you on the right track, and then have something that they can use later. So that's great. Your feature is accepted. You're done, right? No. Now that your feature is there, and now it could be a feature of the product, or it could be an extension that uses, if the project has plugins, for example, now it's your responsibility to promote it, to support it, make sure that when people are reporting problems, they get fixed, or you have responses very quickly. If it's a separate thing, like a tool or a plugin, you may now need to be the release manager for this. You need to package it, make sure that it's available, and you have to track which versions of the upstream project it works against. And finally, you also have to try to encourage outside contributions to this, to your feature. And this is really what winning at open source looks like. It's a whole lot of upfront work, and your reward for this upfront work is end users to support, releases to manage, perhaps, but the real reward is, by going through all of this, you should end up with much better code. You're bouncing it off people that really understand the domain. You should end up with much better, more maintainable code. And there's a chance, if you do it all well, that you will start to get outside contributions. You will get people helping you to fix problems, adding features, and certainly to help stay up to date when there are changes to the upstream. If your code, if your feature is out there and people are using it, other people can help you maintain it and allow you to use the latest version of the upstream code that you really want to in order to get all the other benefits from working with the open source software. So now I'm going to talk about changes that you can make to your organization to try to be more open source friendly. As I've said, as I've been covering, you need to do a lot more than just following the letter of the license of the software that you're using. You really should get permission to work completely in the open. When you're working on these changes that are open source, it should be open from the beginning. And this is a big, difficult change for a lot of organizations. You need to use the development tools, and I would even say switch to the developers' tools, the upstream tools that they use. Use their version control system. Use their issue tracking and workflow management system. and use what they use for testing. It really lowers the barrier to being able to take parts of your code and contribute them as open source, or move things back and forth as necessary. I mean, as you might tell, I love IRC, and I think everybody should be using it. I think you should be using it internally for all your developers. Unplug the developers' telephones. Let them stay in the zone. Let them stay, solving the deep problems in their head and not have interruptions. Let them check the messages when they have a little bit of mental bandwidth to do that. And I think this should apply to everybody. Anybody that's dealing with the developers, technical team management, everyone. If you don't want to run an IRC server locally, you can do what some companies do, and they just use the public ones. This is actually not a terrible idea because it gets your developers in the habit of not talking about proprietary information when they're on IRC. So when they're switching between the open source channels and your company one, they don't have to make that mental switch between, oh, can we talk about this stuff now? I mean, you just keep the development chatter, and you don't talk about proprietary stuff. And always look for opportunities in the code that you're writing to split it up into reusable features, things that you could publish as separate open source features, and reduce the amount of internal business logic to as small as possible. The stuff that nobody but you could possibly maintain needs to be small, and so the code that actually makes that possible should be shared. And so you just have to always look for opportunities to do this, and when you are doing it, make sure you're doing it in the open from the beginning if at all possible, and you're doing it in collaboration with the project developers. So that's my talk. Your goals should be, when working with open source software, to have less code that you maintain by yourself. More features as they come out from the upstream. You should be able to use the latest features as they come out, not weeks later when you finally migrated all of your stuff to the latest version. You want to keep your costs under control, not steadily growing because you are continually backporting things or you are maintaining a too large code base that's separate from the upstream project. Your developers should be involved with the open source communities that matter to them. They should be on the channels. They should be able to ask the questions directly. And of course, any of the fixes and features that you develop, release it as open source software, as I've been saying. And finally, make sure that your organization has an open source friendly culture to make all of this possible.